12. Sado-Masochism. We cannot begin to understand our world without a knowledge of the facts of Sado-Masochism. All men outside of Christ are guilty men, and guilty men are dominated by sadomasochistic activities. Because of their guilt, men either punish themselves as an act of self-atonement, or they punish others. Whatever the problem at hand, people bring to it, not the clear light of reason imagined by rationalists, but a guilt-ridden life and a need to discharge themselves, although vainly, of that guilt. Thus, the greater the number of people in any given social order who seek self-atonement, the more commonly are the problems and questions of that society met by sadomasochistic appeals and answers. A good illustration of this is the women's liberation movement. The leaders of the movement are bent on making men and women alike feel guilty. The cartoonist, Claire Bretisher, broke with the movement over this issue, observing, "Those feminists are doing everything they can to make other women feel guilty." One feminist has written at length to imply that the desire to rape is basic to the male nature, and the history of man-woman relationships has behind it the implied threat of rape if women fail to take their male-appointed place. Many male reviewers applauded this preposterous book. Was it not their masochistic impulses which led them to agree with his savage and abusive work? Men have often brought sadistic impulses to bear on the subject of women and towards the women in their lives. Others come with a masochistic impulse. In neither case do the issues matter. They merely provide a means of giving vent to sadomasochistic impulses. A brilliant scholar of things Soviet has reported on the extensive masochistic death wish of many Soviet students. One told him, "Sooner or later, they'll have to put me in a labor camp. It's convenient, you know, to have a state that lays down hard laws about sin, that caters to one's own shilly-shallying death wish." Pfeiffer himself displays a radical masochism and is a true student radical of the 1960s. He comments of the Russian students, "Few suspect that I'm as envious of them, that I often wish that I'd been born to their deprivation and pressure." Pfeiffer feels guilty because he had a better life and greater opportunities. There is scarcely a political or racial issue which is without its sadomasochistic overtones. The sexual revolution is a prime example of this kind of motivation. The pages of the various, quote, men's, end quote, magazines provide a vast literature of sadomasochism. Before proceeding with an analysis of contemporary sadomasochism, it is important to recognize that popular views of the subject tend to see it as an aspect of all persons, that is, as an ingredient of human psychology, and therefore normal unless pursued to the exclusion of all other concerns. Such is the view of a dictionary which reflects the views of the, quote, sexual revolution, end quote. The authors feel that a man who on payday gets drunk and beats up his wife, and a woman who enjoys humiliating her husband at every turn, are probably sadists according to the definition, but within the bounds of normalcy. The, quote, sexual revolution, end quote, is a poor source of knowledge, of course, because it is sadomasochistic to the core. Brown has said of promiscuous women, in his report on the subject, self-hatred, basic insecurity, hostility toward others, the inability to accept the world as it exists, low ego strength, and sensations of inadequacy and guilt are most frequently listed as components of the damaged personality structure of the promiscuous woman. Is this true only of clinical cases? Quite the contrary. The, quote, letters, end quote, column, as well as the advertisements of any, quote, sexually oriented, quote, periodical, gives abundant evidence of sadomasochism. Thus, one letter writer who gave his address said, "I like to get real nasty." He then described in detail his sadistic sexuality, and his love of degrading the women involved, including urinating on them. He particularly enjoyed a doubly sadomasochistic situation, degrading a masochistic woman while her equally masochistic husband watched. The writer added, "My one ambition is to join a family in incest." In another periodical, and, quote, entertainer, end quote, a singer speaks of her fantasy, a desire for gang rapes by boys or men who have absolutely no respect for me. This woman's, quote, songs, end quote, are sexually oriented. Masochistic desires for self-degradation have been important in the occultist movements, as witness Aleister Crowley, Baudelaire, and others. Occultism has cultivated hatred of itself, liked an association with darkness, the deformed, the perverted, and the ugly. We should note also the homosexual habit of working to make the vulgar and the outrageous into art. Among some groups, such as the Turks, sexuality is closely associated with brutality, satyriasis, and psychosis. Quote, "Sexual revolutionaries affirm a sadomasochistic view of sexuality as the hope of man." Thus, Loduca wrote, "Eroticism represents one of the most profound deliverances of man, of Ver, the male. A severe analysis of its nature and a pitiless examination of its manifestations reveal one fundamental reality. In all our civilizations, virile dignity is sacrificed and humiliated. Man demands, but woman has the power to accord or to refuse. From the outset, from his first attempt to conquer woman, the male is devirilized. We believe this to be the key to the sexual labyrinth. The taste for rape, in all its forms, is thus explicable. The taste for venal love and erotophilia becomes perfectly clear. By rape, the male sates his desire without abdicating his virility. With money, man also retains the total liberty of initiative. Solveo ergo sum. And in practicing eroticism for its own sake, man reserves for himself the intellectual choice and control of his sensual pleasures. A more degraded definition of man is difficult to imagine. I pay for sex, therefore I am, or I rape, therefore I am. Susan Brownmiller's view of rape as basic to men may well have some grounds in the sadomasochistic mentality of advocates of the, quote, sexual revolution, end quote. However, in terms of the view of life held by these people, the only valid goal is happiness, and happiness means whatever anyone chooses to make it mean, including sadomasochism. One editor wrote, "There is only one goal, and only one just recompense, happiness, and we are all in the running equally and together. The rest is hypocrisy and horseshit." In answer to one woman's protest at the account of a savage and perverted rape, the editor answered, "I assume 99.9% of all star sex accounts are fantasy." This is perhaps true of the letters to all such publications, including Penthouse. But the problem is that sadomasochistic fantasies soon make reality look pale, and the results are described by one Miss R.C., aged 35, married 12 years, and with 3 children. She and her husband have enacted or imagined fantasies in order to, quote, vitalize, end quote, their sexual life. My problem here is that I've been running out of fantasies. I cannot get sexually aroused from the same fantasy time after time. I wear them out after a few months, and I find myself at a loss currently. All my deep-seated fantasies have been rehashed, embellished, and just plain worn out. As far as I'm concerned, you can see the same movie so many times before it begins to bore you. Fantasy has been a vital part of my sexual life, and I am at a loss without it. It played a vital part in the only type of masturbation I find pleasurable, mental. The need then is to enter into perversities in order to, quote, enjoy, end quote, sex, and the result is a steady development of Sado-Masochism in many. Sado-Masochism quickly enters into a world of vicious and perverted practices, which even the LA Star documents. Sado-Masochism is very basic to man's being. One prominent caterer to the urge for punishment described the impulse of her patrons as a need for humiliation. It's the emotional humiliation that's the real punishment, and punishment is the right and operative word. All my cases, they all want punishment. The sadomasochist exercises sadism towards some in his life, either through emotional blackmail or punishment, or actual physical punishment. Thus, a person who continually whines and feels sorry for his or herself will be inviting masochistic punishment, that is, disfavour, unpopularity, and conflicts, while at the same time inflicting upon those closely related a sadistic punishment, working to make them feel guilty for what the sadomasochist claims is wrong. In some people, one element or another, sadism or masochism, may prevail, but both are common to all sinful men. Politicians, who regularly exercise their powers for ungodly ends and reasons, are especially prone to masochism. According to two psychiatrists who studied Washington madams and call girls, and found that men in power have a strong predilection for sadomasochism. Such practices involve beatings, degradation, punishment generally, and even being the object of urination and defecation. Homosexuals are especially prone to the latter, to, quote, brown showers, end quote, even to eating a prostitute's defecation. As one girl commented, "They pay between $175 and $200 for that. Can you imagine?" Homosexuals in particular are marked by strong feelings of self-contempt, which they will not admit. In the background lies the modern view of man, the liberal humanist view, with its classical inheritance. Man is the norm, whatever he is, and man is the centre of norms. This is the view of man propagated by films. From this perspective, biblical morality means self-sacrifice and is therefore foolishness, not the way of life. Hence, self-indulgence in sadomasochistic desires is regarded by some as true psychic health, since man is the norm. In such inspired play, we do not regress to childhood in the sense that it drowns us. Rather, we dip into its refreshing waters consciously, and for a moment perhaps recapture something of our lost innocence. This position is logical if we hold that man is the source of all value. The Marquis de Sade took this faith to its logical conclusion. In literature, this view of man has led to dreams of luxurious cruelties and has been called by Pratt the romantic disposition. Sadomasochism is a total perspective, and the sense of guilt in man leads to a sadomasochistic colouring and viewpoint in all things, including politics. The various sexually oriented periodicals are not lacking in political content of a particular sort, muckraking articles which show us to be all victims of the political establishment. In such periodicals as Playboy, Penthouse, Gallery, and many, many more, articles of this sort abound, and sometimes provide the best information on a particular sensational issue. The writers can be socialist, conservative, liberal, libertarian, or anarchist, but a common trait of all these articles is their appeal to masochism. We are rarely given a practical course of remedy. Rather, we are to feel that we have been made victims. We suffer unjustly, and we deserve better, but life gives us a raw deal. For injustice collectors, these periodicals are gold mines. Of course, liberal writers generally tend to give us classical expressions of sadomasochism. Susan Sontag once wrote during the Vietnam War, "The white race is the cancer of human history," a view very widely held by students and academicians, with both masochistic overtones and sadistic intent towards other whites. Susan Sontag has since regretted her sentence, only because she feels the use of illness as such, that is, as metaphor of evil, is invalid. In Illness as a Metaphor, she writes, "The people who have the real disease are hardly helped by hearing their disease's name constantly being dropped as the epitome of evil. Only in the most limited sense is any historical event or problem like an illness. It is invariably an encouragement to simplify what is complex and an invitation to self-righteousness, if not to fanaticism." It was once supposed that sadism was a product of a repressive society, and like views of masochism prevailed. This view is now regarded as a dangerous mistake, but to suggest, as has been done, that boredom is also a stimulus to such excesses is a meaningless answer. In a column about battered wives and, quote, live-in, end quote, partners, Tony Castro wrote about a beautiful young woman who said, "If a man ever hit me, that'd be it. I'd be gone in a New York minute." Somewhat later, Lauren was left well battered by Larry. Her reaction? "I think I'm to blame as much as he. It might have been more my fault than his." Castro commented, "It's an everyday occurrence, I'm told. The man bangs the heck out of the woman and leaves. The woman feels betrayed and seeks out counsel and help. She might even go to a centre for battered wives. When the bruise is gone, the man returns, and all is forgiven. For some reason, however, it seems the woman is often doing the apologising." How common is this? When I left missionary work for an urban pastorate, I was immediately amazed at the stream of people who came with very serious problems which were still open to correction by God's law. These people, however, came not for correction, but, as with previous pastors, for sympathy and, quote, prayers, end quote. But prayers which are not accompanied by corrective measures are blasphemous. When I suggested God's corrective measures, the responses were at first excuses, and then anger, and finally sadistic hostility. It was these responses which drove me to a study of the subject and a reading of Theodore Reich's Masochism in Modern Man and the work of Dr. Edmund Bergler. I saw that Sado-Masochism was using the church as a means of hiding its nature. 2 decades later, I saw similar reactions from many to my Institutes of Biblical Law. By calling attention to God's answers to our problems, I was calling for their resolution and solution as normal to the Christian life, whereas Sado-Masochism, hiding behind a mask of super piety, wants no solution, only continued injustice collecting, self-righteous hostilities and assaults, usually verbal, and masochistic self-pity as it wallows in sin. In one major city, a layman who engineered the capture of a church and Christian school and the expulsion of the pastor now is full of masochistic fears and regularly checks his car for bombs. Where there is no atonement, men and women are adept at engineering situations in which they see themselves as the abused, not the abusers, as sinned against, not as sinning. I have seen men and women of strongly masochistic tendencies work imaginatively to create situations wherein they can act with sadistic violence in the name of defending themselves. One man spent several weeks in masochistic brooding about imaginary wrongs against him by his young bride in order to justify his, quote, punishment, end quote, of her, which included lighted cigarettes thrust into her vagina. He came from a, quote, good, end quote, family, and few found it believable, other than the doctor. The girl, as a young convert, escaped and secured a divorce. Ploss and Bartels rightly observed, The human mind always sins with a good excuse. What Sado-Masochism provides for sinners is an ostensible means of sinning with self-justification, of atonement by means of sin. Woodward was right in this, if little else, when he observed of masochists. Guilt must be expiated. Sin must be punished. What the sinner does in this process of self-atonement is to plead guilty to a lesser offence, one in which he or she is more sinned against than sinning. He works out then a means of self-atonement, and accordingly reacts with rage against God and man, because no cleansed conscience results. Neurosis, which is at root Sado-Masochism, has as its identifying marks the inability to work, to love, to have normal social contacts, interests and hobbies, and, above all, to be an injustice collector. Thus, Sado-Masochism leads not to social unity and productivity, but to unrest, conflict and destruction. The Sado-Masochist destroys himself and his world. Obedience to God's law is productive of social progress. Disobedience is destructive. As Solomon sees so clearly, wisdom declares, "For whoso findeth me findeth life, and shall obtain favour of the Lord. But he that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death." Proverbs chapter 8, verses 35 and 36. William Gothard has most tellingly described the mental problems and conflicts of most people. Among the gifts of God to us, there are 4 things which are, in essence, beyond our ability to change: our essential appearance, our aptitudes, our family into which we were born, and our social economic situation in childhood. As Gothard points out, most people resent some or all of these things. Their resentment is thus basically against the God who made them. Psalm 139, verses 13 to 17. Such resentment is destructive, not productive, and it leads to self-pity, that rich seedbed of Sado-Masochism. It leads to rebellion against reality, and to pleasure in displeasure. It results in the will to lose, in order to prove that God is immoral and the sinner justified. Marriage becomes for all such a fertile arena for sadomasochistic activities. Long before Reich and Burglar, Proverbs described all such as suicidal as lovers of death. Many criminals, themselves sadomasochistic, justify their activities by appealing to the fact of universal sadomasochism. One pimp declared, "They beg me to hustle them. The whole world is masochistic." A whole succession of observers have noted the sadomasochism of both prostitutes and their clients. Furthermore, much interracial sexuality has like motivation. One Negro writer reported, "Some of the black men in London have told me about episodes where they've hustled, or more accurately, been hustled by white women, some of whom are relatives of people in the British government and of royalty. The black men would take these ladies home and make love to them every which way, after which they would kick the women out of bed, beat them maybe, and then stand up and urinate on them. The men were amazed that they could get away with such goings-on, as well as at how much gratification the women seemed to derive." There is more than a little confirmation of this fact. Much of what passes for interracial brotherhood is not a godly concern, but masochism. It is the unatoned sinner working out a humanistic atonement. Sin is defined humanistically, and then absolution sought cheaply. It proves, however, to be no absolution at all. The sinner wants atonement on his own terms, by means of sadomasochistic works. At the same time, because his sin is the desire to be God, Genesis chapter 3 verse 5, nothing in either sin or self-atonement can ever satisfy him. He dreams, however, of the infinite God-like self-realization. The white pimp, from a very rich family, whom Gail Sheehy interviewed, said of himself, "Every 24 hours, this hustler goes for Google, the score of scores. Pronounce it Google, mathematical infinity, a number that is equal to 1 followed by 100 zeros." This is a common opinion, usually stated more pretentiously. That is, it is the quest, not the goal, which is important. Seeking truth, whether it exists or not finding it, and so on and on. It is a sophisticated way of saying that one prefers to live in fantasy permanently, not in reality. It means choosing hell over heaven. An old anonymous poem witnesses to the fact that this preference for one's imagination over reality is not new. There is not half so warm a fire in the fruition as desire. When I have got the fruit of pain, possession makes me poor again. Expected forms and shapes unknown whet and make sharp temptation. Sense is too niggardly for bliss, and pays me dully with what is. But fancy's liberal and gives all that can within her vastness fall. Veil therefore still, while I divine the treasure of this hidden mine, and make imagination tell what wonders doth in beauty dwell. Where such a mentality prevails, marriages fail. Reality is detested in favour of fantasy. In politics, it means that an ideal country, always either foreign or imagined, is used to damn one's own country, whose sins alone are visible, while the Sado-Masochist, in his fantasies, is its innocent victim, crying out in protest against a universal and outer evil. There is no solution to the problem of Sado-Masochism and to the root problem it points to, sin and guilt, except through Christ's atonement. But when we approach Christ's atonement, we must do so on biblical terms, or we are humanists and sinners still. We must define our words and doctrines in terms of Scripture. The Reverend Don Farrenbrink writes, "Mercy is mercy, in the name of Christ or not." Kuan Yin, the Chinese goddess of mercy, is one who refused to enter paradise so long as any human being is excluded. Thus, she still remains outside the gates of heaven. The Unitarian Conway and the Buddhists find this view of mercy most noble, but it is not Christian. In a classic story of Buddhist mercy, a man, seeing a starving tigress and her cubs below him, jumps off a cliff to feed them with his own body. Is this Christian mercy? Mercy, like all moral acts, varies in nature in terms of the theology which undergirds the morality. In the Bible, mercy is defined in terms of God. It is His covenant act. It manifests His grace, favour, holiness, righteousness, and law, and our mercy must reflect His mercy. It is not to be lawless or graceless, nor can it be humanistic. The same is true of forgiveness. Reverend C.S. Lovett calls attention to all the good mercy and forgiveness do to us and to our psychology. To be forgiving removes emotional stress, we are told. All this may be true, but it is irrelevant to the central question. Dare we forgive or refuse to forgive, except in terms of God's law word? All attempts to reduce mercy, forgiveness, love, good works, or anything else to humanistic terms results in bypassing Scripture or using it partially and wrongly. It also feeds man's attempts at self-atonement. But such attempts fail, and the failures feed man's self-pity and his sadomasochistic expressions of self-pity. There are no end runs around the cross and Christ's atonement to mental health and freedom from sin and guilt. All sin is essentially against God, and before there can be effective restitution towards men, in terms of God's law, There must be atonement to God in terms of God's law through the vicarious substitute, Jesus Christ. There are two ways of atonement in essence, Sado-Masochism on the one hand, and the cross of Christ on the other. The one compounds sin, whereas the other delivers us from its bondage. The Sado-Masochist becomes one who loves death, is suicidal and destructive, whereas the redeemed in Christ have everlasting life, and, in terms of God's covenant law, exercise dominion and are fruitful unto God. Reich attempted to find cultural values in masochism, and he tried to reinterpret Christianity as a masochistic religion. His, quote, solution, end quote, was to ask masochists to be tolerant towards themselves and to avoid the sense of guilt. This was a pathetically shallow answer to a very deep problem. Sinful man's being cries out for atonement as surely as it demands food. Man, created in God's image, cannot live at peace with himself except in terms of peace with God and living in faithfulness to his covenant law. For a psychoanalyst like Reich, who knew the deep roots of man's unconscious being, to come up with so superficial a solution to the problem is evidence of humanism's inability to deal with the problem of Sado-Masochism. Those who know the truth of Scripture know that it can only be solved by God through Christ. There is no other way.